It all started with a single blood-red rose, planted right where the HOA bylaws strictly forbade it. I remember the day old Mrs. Gable moved in, a woman with a smile as gentle as a morning breeze and a spirit as tough as an oak tree. She was quiet, kept to herself, and spent her mornings puttering around her front garden. Mr. Henderson was a man who lived by the rule book, a binder of laminated pages he carried with him everywhere. He was the kind of person who saw a slightly overgrown lawn as a personal affront, a mailbox leaning a degree to the left as a sign of moral decay. He had a fine for everything. Missed trash can collection? Fine. Non-compliant shutters? Fine. But this was different. This was a direct, unspoken challenge to his authority. The very first violation in Mrs. Gable's new life here. The first notice came in the mail, a crisp white envelope with the HOA letterhead. It was a formal violation for unapproved, non-native ornamental flora. The letter cited Section 7.4, 2 of the bylaws, something about maintaining a consistent aesthetic. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, simply ignored it. She just kept on tending to her garden, watering her rose, which by now had grown a second bloom. This was a mistake, of course. Mr. Henderson saw the ignored notice not as a simple oversight, but as an act of war. The next notice arrived a week later, this time with a $50 fine attached. It was the talk of the cul-de-sac. People were buzzing, whispering in their driveways, speculating on what Mrs. Gable would do. A few of the more timid neighbors suggested she just pull the rose up. It was only one little bush after all. But I knew better. There was something in her eyes, a quiet defiance that said this wasn't just about a plant. Mrs. Gable's refusal to budge led to an all-out war. The fines escalated. The second fine was for $100. The third, $200. Mr. Henderson, with his perfect lawns and perfectly spaced azaleas, was becoming obsessed. He would stand at the end of the street, just staring at the lone crimson rose, as if willing it to wither and die. The neighbors were split. The old guard, the ones who had lived under Henderson's tyranny for years, were nervous. They wanted the rose gone just to get back to their quiet, rule-abiding lives. But the younger families, the ones with kids and a slightly more relaxed view on life, started to see the rose as a symbol of defiance. Someone even placed a small, hand-painted sign next to it that said, "Mrs. Gable's Rose of Rebellion." The climax came at the next HOA meeting. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Mr. Henderson stood at the front, his face flushed with righteous indignation, the binder of rules clutched in his hand. He went on and on about the sanctity of the bylaws, about how one small infraction could lead to total aesthetic collapse. He demanded the board approve legal action to force Mrs. Gable to remove the plant. And that's when Mrs. Gable, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. Her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of the room. She didn't talk about the bylaws or the fines. Instead, she talked about her late husband, Thomas. She told us how he had been a botanist, how he had dedicated his life to creating new, beautiful rose hybrids. The crimson rose in her garden, she explained, was the last one he ever created, a unique bloom he had cultivated from a seed he found on a trip. He had named it Elegy for Eleanor, after his grandmother. He had been so proud of it, she said, a single, perfect flower that would remind him of the beauty in the small things. A murmur went through the crowd. No one had known. We just saw a plant, a violation. Not a memorial, a tribute, a piece of someone's heart. But Mr. Henderson, ever the rule enforcer, was unmoved. "Sentimental value does not override a bylaw, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice cold and devoid of all empathy. "The rule is the rule." And that's when the twist came. A quiet man named Jim, who had been sitting in the corner, cleared his throat. He was an old friend of Mrs. Gable's husband. He stood up, a small, faded photograph in his hand. "The rule," he said, his voice low, "was a personal vendetta. Thomas had entered a rose-growing competition a few years back. The judge was Mr. Henderson." The room went silent. Jim explained that Thomas's rose had been the clear winner, but Henderson, a man with a deep-seated grudge over a small misunderstanding years prior, had disqualified Thomas on a technicality. The rule about non-native ornamental flora, it turned out, was a rule Henderson had pushed through the board a few years ago, specifically to prevent Thomas from ever planting his creations in a community that would judge them fairly. When Thomas died, Henderson, seeing Mrs. Gable move in, thought he had a new way to get his revenge. The truth hung in the air like a thick fog. All this time, it was never about the bylaws. It was about a decades-old grudge, a man using his power to settle a petty score. The neighbors were furious. The meeting, which was supposed to be about legal action against Mrs. Gable, quickly turned into a vote of no confidence. That night, Mr. Henderson was voted out as president. The next day, every single neighbor on the street planted a single crimson rose in their own front yard. And the HOA, in a grand gesture of a new era, voted to name Mrs. Gable's rose the official flower of the neighborhood. The rose was a little beacon of hope, a reminder that the best kind of rules are the ones made with the heart, not just a rule book.